This car did some sort of a Benjamin Button because when it was released in 1974, it didn't look as wacky as it did or as youthful and exuberant as it did in 1989. Hello and welcome to the Car Nerd Talks, where today I'm going to be talking about the Lamborghini Countach, which is definitely the coolest car of the 80s. Of course, it was produced in the 70s and it was probably the coolest car of the 70s as well. Every child my age had a bedroom poster on their wall, and unfortunately it was discontinued in the year I was born, 1989. And this car did some sort of a Benjamin Button because when it was released in 1974, it didn't look as wacky as it did or as youthful and exuberant as it did in 1989. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we do, don't forget to like and subscribe and check in every single day for brand new content. And of course, check me out on drivetribe.com, where I do at least a daily article, some days 20. Let's jump straight into it and talk about the Lamborghini Countach. So as you're probably aware, the Miura was released in 1966, and this was produced by a guy called Paolo Stanzani. And Stanzani built the car in secret without Ferruccio Lamborghini's knowledge. He put together a crack team of Lamborghini engineers and designers in the back, and then eventually brought in Marcello Gandini, the famous designer, to create the Miura. And then they mounted one of the V-tail 12 tractor engines that Lamborghini had built transversely in the car and created the Miura. And the Miura was an incredible success, which changed Ferruccio Lamborghini's mind about only producing Grand Tours. So they decided to make a sports car. Now, the year was 1970, and Ferruccio Lamborghini decided that it was time for a successor to the Miura to be made. In that short 4-year time, the industry had moved a lot, maybe because of the Miura. I think the Miura really pushed people to come up with something crazier. And in 1970, you had the likes of the Ferrari Daytona. So the issue with this was that the looks of the Daytona had moved on quite a bit from the conservative look of Ferraris before then, which were very much to the upper class sports owner. So Lamborghini wanted Paul Stanzani to come up with something absolutely ridiculous. So he challenged him to come up with two different things. He said this car needs to be high performance, it needs to be stable, and it needs to just be an incredibly aerodynamic design. And the second thing that it needed to do was challenge the industry. And what he meant by that was it needed to be a radical design that, like the Miura, would blow everything else out of the water. And I think if you look at something like the Ferrari Daytona from the time, which would have looked ridiculous for a Ferrari back then, it doesn't even come close to the Lamborghini. So Stanzani went on and started working on this car, and he had the full trust of Lamborghini after working on the Miura. So if you're going to design the next wave of radical looking supercars, there's really only one man you're going to go to, and that's the man who designed the Miura in the first place, Marcello Gandini. Now Marcello Gandini by this time was working with Bertone on a lot of Alfa Romeos and different concepts. So this is exactly where they went to get the successor to the Miura. Now Stanzani and his team were working on the engine and chassis components, so they had pretty much all of the dimensions that Marcello Gandini would need. So they gave everything to him and asked him could he go ahead and start designing the car, which he did. Now a couple of years prior to this, in 1968, Marcello Gandini had worked on a concept car for Alfa Romeo called the Carabo. And the Carabo looks very similar to what would become the Countach. And as you can see here, it had that wedge-shaped design. Now, basically Gandini had started experimenting with this new Italian wedge shape, or the folded paper shape as it would become known, and he absolutely loved it. But when he designed this for Alfa Romeo and one of the Lancia concept cars, they weren't over the moon about putting something like this into production. It was a huge risk, but he knew that Lamborghini wanted something absolutely radical, so this was the perfect excuse to bring this in, and that is where he went. So if you look at the LP500 concept car that was unveiled at the 1971 Geneva Auto Show, you can see that the wedge shape is exactly where he went. And funnily enough, the wedge-shaped version that was released at that auto show looks essentially like the 25th anniversary version, or basically the later version with all of the bits and knobs and big rear wing. It looks more like the last version than the original production version does. So once they unveiled this, it garnered a ton of press attention, and this won over Stanzani and Ferruccio, and basically convinced them that this is the way the car had to go. And it had some very, very unique features. It had side vents to put air into the engine. It had a very wedged front end, and it just looked incredible. It also had a feature that nowadays seems like the icon of the 70s and 80s, but at the time this was one of the first. Basically, to get this wedge shape to work with current safety standards like seat belts and so on, they couldn't have the headlights as low as they wanted to with the wedge shape design. So Gandini decided it was time to put in something different. And this is where it has an iconic feature that every male around my age absolutely loves, in pop-up headlamps. So Gandini also moved this stark, weird design into the interior. And the interior had a lot of 90-degree angles, and it was like it was designed by a ruler. It was very odd for the time. He wanted a full digital display, like was on the Lagonda, which would come a few years later. Unfortunately, they decided against this because they just didn't have time, so there was analog readouts the whole way through the cabin. However, it was just a very, very weird looking car inside. And because of that small rear window, it also had a very weird interior feature that you might not be aware of because it was removed later on from these cars. So because of the small rear window, a rear view mirror was basically no use. So they had a periscope designed instead, so you could see behind you. Unfortunately, this didn't make it to many of the production cars, and instead users would use a unique way of parallel parking the Countach, which I'll get onto in a minute after I speak about what is by far the best design on this car. So Gandini decided that this car would have one thing that he had put into a couple of concept cars before but had been shot down on. For example, on the same Alfa Romeo Carbo, it had scissor doors that went upwards, or billionaire doors as they like to call them. Unfortunately, Alfa Romeo again thought that this concept was way ahead of its time and just wouldn't sell. But Gandini wasn't finished with using these, and when he showed it to Ferruccio and Stanzani, they loved it. This was a feature that would stand out and make the Lamborghini sit apart from everything else. It went into that concept that Lamborghini wanted, which was radical. So these scissor doors were fitted, and the press and people loved them. And these nowadays are known as Lambo doors. You don't call them scissor doors anymore, they are now Lambo doors, which leads me back to that periscope. Because the periscope was removed and back rear visibility was basically gone in this car, what a lot of Countach users decided to do was they would open the scissor doors, sit on the door sill, and reverse the car while sitting outside. So this scissor door not only looks amazing, it was also functional too. In terms of engine, as I've mentioned in previous videos, in the Miura, a 3.9 litre V12 was mounted transversely at the back of the car, and you can watch more about that here. However, in this car, they wanted to use the same V12 engine but mount it longitudinally. So this was an interesting way of putting the engine in, which I'll explain in a minute. But first of all, we have to give props to that engine, because not only was it going in the Countach, that same V12, obviously modified over time, would be in every single Lamborghini until Volkswagen killed off the Murcielago in 2010. This V12 had a 54-year lifespan, which is incredible. It just shows how versatile and durable this engine was. So they took that 3.9 litre engine and they tried to bore it to a 5 litre, but unfortunately they couldn't get durability issues out of the way in time for the auto show. So the car in the LP400, which was the first production version of the Countach, was launched with a 3.9 litre engine. However, this was an odd setup for an engine. Now they mounted the V12 longitudinally in the mid at the back. Now this wasn't the first time this was ever done. In fact, Ferrari had used this same setup on their P racing cars. However, there was an issue with this. Stanzani thought that they needed to update and tweak the layout because it would cause some rear to front, or front to rear, weight distribution errors. So he wanted to make sure there was a 50-50 or as close to 50-50 weight distribution as possible. So to do this, he did something strange. Him and his engineers took the transmission, and instead of running it out through the back, they ran it out through the front towards the cabin. They connected this directly to the clutch, which is a very strange way of doing things, and this was still done on a lot of the Lamborghinis going forward. I believe the Murcielago has a similar setup. But then you still had to drive from the transmission to the rear wheels. So to figure out this whole thing, they basically set up a transaxle that would run through the engine's oil sump back to the rear of the car, hitting a differential which would then drive the rear wheels. This is a really weird setup. Now, like I said, they had to launch the car with a 3.9 litre V12 because the 5 litre board version that they had hit some durability issues, so this meant that they had to stick with the 3.9. Now, Stanzani and his team did manage to push this from 342 horsepower to 370, which is better than the Miura. However, it didn't stand up to the 440 horsepower that they were looking for. This car later on though would get a 4.6 litre V12, and follow on from that it would get a 5.2 litre V12 in the Quattro Valvoli. When they brought in the 5.2 litre Quattro Valvoli V12, they also replaced the 6 Weber carbs that were on the Countach since the original with direct fuel injection, and they had to do this for emission standards at the time. In terms of performance, the Countach might look like a hyper aerodynamic car, but that wedge shape was not aerodynamic at all. In fact, it hit the air like a ton of bricks. That, including the flat window and wedge shapes everywhere, meant this car was not aerodynamic at all. Thankfully, they made up for this with the engine, but it wasn't the hyper-performance car that you probably think of it as. Now, it did have some very good figures though. The 3.9 litre engine that was in the original P400 that was launched in 1974 would hit 179 miles an hour, and it would go from 0 to 60 in 5.4 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot today, especially compared to the newer Lamborghinis, but this was 1974, and that was a very good top speed. However, in 1988, for the 25th anniversary edition, they would get this all the way up to 205 miles an hour with the new 5.2 litre twin turbocharged Quattro Valvoli, and get that 0 to 60 time down to 4.5 seconds, which are not bad figures at all. My final word on this is that this is one of the most incredibly influential cars of all time, and I absolutely love it. It was on my wall when I was a kid. I had a little toy of it, and I'm sure you did as well if you're watching this. It was just a stunning car. And some interesting things about this is it sold 1,983 units during its lifetime, over half of which were sold in the last 5 years during the roaring 80s, when those Wall Street titans decided this was the car to drive. And that last version also didn't have a mirror to check yourself in the passenger side visor. It had a removable mirror that you could use to fix yourself up. Now, you may be aware that this was around the Miami times of cocaine, so we won't get into what that mirror was used for, but that's probably it. This car changed how Lamborghini saw their cars from now on, and how Lamborghini is seen as that insane car maker. Another interesting fact is that the 25th anniversary edition that was released in 1988 was produced and redesigned by Horacio Pagani, who you're probably aware went on to create the Pagani Motor Company. So that's another interesting one there. This car was just a really strange car and bucked all the trends. One thing is though that this is one of those cars that, unless I could buy one as a spare car just to look at, I don't think I'd ever want to drive it, because I've heard from plenty of people who have driven these that it is a bit of a letdown when you get behind the wheel. It has a lot of fallbacks that you wouldn't have heard of, a lot of issues that you probably don't know about. So It's one of those don't meet your hero type cars. But it's definitely one that I will always admire, look at, and I would love to own, even if it is just a big paper block out on my driveway. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow where I'll be talking about the XK120 Jaguar that was built purely to hold an engine. Thanks again.